why they've reached this decision, but it appears that they've ignored the requests made by the United States and actually been independent and made an independent decision based on what's best for Gibraltar and I guess what's best for the UK at large, and that's to release the Grace 1 tanker with immediate effect.
Stand by. Let me go to Ontario to Jason Unruhe, political commentator analyst, who's joining us also. Jason, how do you look at this? In the first place, the U.S. said that they have made some allegations. The Justice Department asked last minute to stop the release of the supertanker, Grace 1. And then we just hear that we had the breaking news out that the arrest order is revoked. What could be those U.S. Any allegations? Because nobody told us about it, even the barrister attending the court session.
Well, to be perfectly honest, what the United States had only put forward was an accusation. I had looked at the situation fairly closely, and I did not see any evidence of the accusation being put forward. I mean, this is very typical of the United States. They make a blanket accusation. They don't present any evidence whatsoever to back it up, and then they demand that everybody follow what it is that they dictate to them. This is not how a court of law works. A court of law works by a series of rules that lays down the procedures and the rights of both the governing state and the individuals who have been arrested, and they have to act according to evidence, suspicion, etc. Not simply what the United States dictates to them. So the ruling in this case, the fact that they just decided to release the oil tanker, release the individuals that were maintaining the crew of the oil tanker, etc., shows that the United States was not able to show any evidence of the accusation that they had made, and that at least the Gibraltar government did not feel that it was necessary to go along with U.S. demands in this case. In other words, the rule of law successfully proceeded, which begs the question as to why the tanker was seized to begin with. I understand if they get a notification that something suspicious might be happening, they are obligated to check it out. But hopefully this will be an instance where the United States will be seen as crying wolf in this situation. But I think the more important thing here in this situation is the fact that this is a continuing trend of the U.S. to make accusations with no evidence. As we saw with the withdrawal from the JCPOA, there was no evidence of this Iranian violation of the agreement. There was nothing. What was put forward by Israel was dismissed as complete and utter nonsense and documentation that existed before the agreement had been put into effect. And then, most hilariously, they accused a former carpet cleaning place of being an Iranian nuclear facility. There was no evidence to suggest what it is that the U.S. was claiming whatsoever. And they seem to have done the same thing with Russia as well with regards to the International Intermediate Range Missile Treaty. They also accused Russia of violating this agreement, and again presented absolutely no evidence whatsoever of it. So this seems to be a continuing pattern by U.S. President Trump, and we can extend this into trade even further. He claimed that the NAFTA agreements with China and the European Union were unfair to the United States, the richest country in the world. Somehow the richest country was the one who was being taken advantage of. And yet through all of this, still no evidence of these accusations were presented, and this seems to be exactly the way that the United States tends to function, but has functioned even more so under the presidency of Donald Trump, where they feel that in the end, without saying it, but certainly in action, that might makes right. They have the power to do it, therefore whatever it is that they do is automatically right, and that it seems to be the modus operandi of the United States. As I said, common for the United States, but much more so under Donald Trump. And this decision by Gibraltar to release the tanker will no doubt irk the United States. It'll create a bit of controversy inside of Washington. This was something that Trump did want, most likely motivated by the war hawks, particularly John Bolton. So in the end, it's going to tarnish the U.S. reputation somewhat, because they had insisted over and over again that there was some alleged illegal dealings going on. There was activities that ran in contradictions of the law, and yet in the end, once an investigation was done, it was shown that there was absolutely nothing. So now, at least in this situation, many of the countries around the world, or at least many of the large economic players, are going to see this as just the United States lying once again and trying to politicize international law in order to carry out the pressure that they want to carry out against Iran, since having withdrawn from the JCPOA agreement, they had essentially used the law as a weapon against a country whose only crime was essentially refusing to be a U.S. colony. And I think that that's made all that little bit much more clear to many of the powers and economic players around the world.
Now, let's go back to Ontario. Jason, we have this breaking news here. I'm reading out for you that the Gibraltar government has received assurances, written assurances from the Iranian government that the ship won't discharge its cargo in Syria. This is what Chronicle is saying. And Iran, in the first place, said when the seizure happened that the ship was not destined for Syria. Basically, Syrian ports are not spacious and big enough to be able to allow the super tanker with that, huge size to be able to stop there and discharge or load or unload anything. I mean, nothing was possible actually to be done. And there are two aspects to this. Firstly, the fact that the Syrian ports could not actually house the ship and allow it to berth. And the second one, that that thing was done based on, as the UK said, based on EU sanctions regarding Syria. And former Mr. Zarif had a presser a few days ago in which he said that EU countries and their sanctions do not apply. This is what the EU has asserted itself, do not apply outside of the EU borders. And that was Gibraltar. So in the first place, how could that seizure be made in the very first place?
Well, I think the real question is here is that this the fact that there are EU sanctions was just an excuse to try to stop the Iranian tanker. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that it was going to Syria. So you have the EU saying that because it was one of their ports that they have the right to detain it. Well, this would be a tremendous hindrance of international trade, simply because one country has sanctions that another country is not obligated to follow. And you no longer have a rule of law anymore. You have a very inconsistent application of them. And now other countries which don't have jurisdictions over others can force their rules on them. So what we're seeing is not just an abuse of power to undermine Iran, but a phenomenon that could, in general, destabilize trade. Because if another ship comes to the port and they're not obligated to follow certain laws, they're going to start questioning, are they going to force me to follow their laws, even though they have no jurisdiction? And this is a tremendous hindrance to global trade, which requires ships to go to different ports in different countries in the course of delivering goods very specifically. So I think that this was a very foolish move on the part of Gibraltar, or pardon me, the EU, to demand that an investigation must take place because of our rules that don't apply to someone else. This can cause a kind of uncertainty, and especially with regards to oil, energy, which is something that's subject to great fluctuations based on political machinations, even incidents like these. And this is another very clear instance where the EU is trying to project its power onto someone else. I mean, this is very similar to what it is the United States does to many countries around the world. They create a law and other people are obligated to follow it. We saw this exact same thing with the U.S. withdrawing from the JCPOA and then punishing the remaining European allies for remaining in it. They have every legal right to carry out trade with Iran, even with the U.S. withdrawal. In fact, a responsibility to do so. And yet the United States decided that they were going to punish any European companies who decided to continue doing business inside of Iran. Well, if you're going to continue there, then you're going to be sanctioned in trying to deal with the United States. So I think that this is a continuation of that policy. It's very strange how they would do this to Iran and then turn around and complain that the United States was doing it to them. It seems almost hypocritical in this situation for them to be carrying out these actions, and they're perfectly fine. But then when someone does it to them under somewhat similar circumstances, it's considered the wrong thing to do and a violation of their rights. But this is the way that we've seen a lot of what has been going on from the beginning of the entire JCPOA agreement. Now, the United States can make any dictates it wants, but it essentially has no right to tell Iran how it can develop its nuclear technology, whether that be peaceful or not peaceful. It's really not the United States' responsibility, and it's not even their right to be able to tell anyone to be able to do this or do that regarding their own energy concerns. And in my opinion, the only reason there was a JCPOA to begin with was because the United States had threatened and coerced Iran into signing them with sanctions to begin with. In my view, this has been nothing more than an entire gangster act right from the entire beginning, a bullying tactic by the United States. And I think that they saw that the JCPOA agreement was not, while it was doing its claim, it was achieving its claimed goal. It, however, was not forwarding the cause of promoting regime change inside the country, and that's eventually what it is that the United States wants. I'm sure there was some aspect of Donald Trump's ego to want to undermine the Iran deal because Obama had created it, but I think that there's a larger goal here of promoting a regime change, and that's why it was eventually canceled.
Okay, let me put the same question to Jason Unruhe in Ontario. Jason, how could this court order, I mean, the U.S. asked for it, Justice Department asked for the detention to go on, but the request fell on deaf ears, and they had no grounds, and they just let Grace 1 supertanker to set sail. What kind of consequences could this have? What could it mean for the U.S. administration?
Well, I think your other guest is very right in his description of how this will play out for the United States. The U.S. has essentially cried wolf, saying that there was wrongdoings going on, and there wasn't. So when they came around again with the same accusation, and I assume the same amount of evidence, none whatsoever, the court was not willing to listen to their baseless accusations. So the United States is in a very difficult situation right now. The Dow is down 800, as your previous guest said. That's a very significant number. This is a very dangerous time at which the economy could go either way. Either Trump could do the right thing and repair some of the damage, or he could be his usual unpredictable self and make it worse. I think that many of his advisors are probably coming to him right now saying that he needs to be very, very careful about what he does next, and the importance behind that. The U.S. is on a tipping point where the economy could tank almost entirely. In fact, potentially there could be a global recession as a result of his actions. I saw in U.S. business news that mortgage debts right now are slightly higher than they were before the 2008 financial crisis. And that's a very significant aspect to this. Unpaid mortgages arise as a result of the inability of individuals to be able to pay them. And we've seen somewhat of a decrease in the earning power of regular Americans as a result of many of the policies put forward by Donald Trump, the elimination of protections for certain workers, the quote-unquote right-to-work legislation that has been introduced in many states, etc. And these things are all things that hurt regular people, even if they are supporters of Donald Trump, and in some cases do affect the supporters of Donald Trump even more so than other sections of the U.S. population. Already, the U.S. government has had to put in $16 billion in bailouts to farmers inside the U.S. because of the ongoing trade war with China, which isn't seeming to harm China anywhere near to the degree that it's harming the United States. But the United States is being cost money right now. They're not making money off of this. It's costing them that. And many of the farmers, particularly rural white Americans who did predominantly vote for Donald Trump in the situation, are now very much turning against him because of it. They are seeing tremendous drops in revenues, and they're getting a tiny stipend handout from the U.S. government when they should be getting a lot more by selling many of their agricultural products to China as it is. And I'm sure many of them have been paying attention to when Wall Street said that the proposed retaliatory tariffs by China for the latest rounds of tariffs that have been put by Donald Trump are considered to be 11 out of a scale of 1 to 10 on the amount of damage that they could do to the U.S. population. One of those being presenting the idea of cutting off all agricultural imports from the United States, and that would be absolutely devastating. One of the things that he promised when during his campaign was to bring back the jobs. He was going to bring back the strong middle class union type jobs, while he certainly has done nothing of the sort. There's been no such resurgence of any such jobs, and particularly unions have been undermined by his presidency. Most of the jobs that have been created, and this is not entirely him, but a trend that had been going on for a few years before he had actually come to office, was the creation of more part-time work or involuntary underemployment as a result of this. And all of these things are going to pile up against the people that voted for him during the last election, and this could be exactly what it is that would be the kick that they need in order to no longer support him, to end their support for his presidency. And then the Republican Party would have a very difficult problem ahead of them, how to get rid of Donald Trump and replace him with someone who is much more responsible in the position of power that Trump now does hold. And all of these things, as your previous guest said, these are all little things that are adding up. And they say, the old saying of dying from 1,000 small cuts, and that may be what happens right here. This trade war with China could be the very end of that. U.S. hegemony in the world could very much come to an end as a result of the irresponsible actions of Donald Trump himself. And I think that even people who generally don't pay attention to these kinds of things are definitely paying attention to what's going on inside their own wallet, especially many of those rural whites who predominantly voted for Trump and saw much of their incomes shrink as a result of this trade war with China. And there's going to be a lot of hostility that they have toward him as a result of that. And what that will amount to in the next election remains to be seen.